Hi, my name is Kara-Leah with the Yoga Lunchbox. Today I'm interviewing Philip Shepherd all the way from Canada. So Philip is an international authority on embodiment, and he has created something that's called the Embodied Present Process, which we'll find out about in the interview. But Philip's coming down to Australia and New Zealand over the next 6 weeks to deliver a series of workshops, including Radical Wholeness, which is also the name of his second book, which has just come out recently. Philip, welcome to the Yoga Lunchbox.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I so look forward to arriving down under very soon.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about you, and Lucinda, my editor, she sent me some links. She's like, "Hey, read this," and I started reading the interview that you did with the Sun newspaper, and I was hooked from like paragraph 1. I'm like, this guy's my kind of guy, so I'm really excited to talk to you because, obviously Yoga Lunchbox, we're about yoga, but ultimately yoga's presence, right? It's embodiment. And I like the fact that people like you are doing this work without necessarily using labels that other people might find off-putting, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is the work you do? What is radical wholeness? Like, I say that, I'm like, radical wholeness. Who doesn't want that, right?
Yeah. So what is radical wholeness is a good question, because in our culture, we love wholeness. We shop at Whole Foods over here. We practice holistic medicine, but we have turned wholeness into something that has denatured it. So what I mean by that is we conceive of and experience wholeness within a boundary. Mm-hmm. Wholeness doesn't have a boundary. Wholeness is all-inclusive, excludes nothing. So when we aspire to wholeness, we might aspire to be whole in body, mind, and spirit, as though there were these 3 aspects of the self that just needed to each flourish and come into balance, and we would be whole, as though the world played no role in that. So the wholeness that I speak about in my book, that I help people towards in my workshops, is one that begins to undo the boundaries, so many of them unseen, living in our neurology without our being aware of it, because you take messages into the body before you're old enough to frame a question about it, and it lives there, and if you're not aware of a pattern in the body, it runs without accountability. It just runs the show. It's when you become aware of the pattern that suddenly you have choice.
I'm noticing this more and more in my meditation practice, like in the sitting in stillness, becoming aware of very subtle programs, of some that feel cultural, not necessarily personal.
Absolutely. So people feel frustration and anxiety, and the tendency is to think, what's wrong with me? There is this cultural message that tells us as children, you are alone. Aloneness is the human condition. And it's like we're taken as seedlings and stuck into this pot of aloneness and told, grow there. So if you feel alone, you create this boundary around the self, and then everything is personal experience rather than shared experience. And when there's a boundary around your experience, your primary task in life is to monitor that experience and manage it and make it successful. Mm-hmm. And so our primary relationship in our culture is to the self. I mean, it's this impoverishment, but you think about how much time in the day you might spend thinking about your thoughts, modifying them, correcting them, arranging them, anticipating them. And meanwhile, here's the wholeness of the world that carries you in its embrace. And I think of the body like a resonator, almost like a bell. And it's ringing to the present in every moment. And in our culture, it's like we stuff the bell full of cotton balls, and then the present is going ding, ding, and we forget it's there as a living continuum that feels us and knows us more intimately than we know ourselves.
Mm. So that sense of like being primarily orientated to the self, it's not endemic to all cultures though, is it? Like it's primarily like a Western way of orientating.
It's been initiated by the Neolithic Revolution. So prior to the Neolithic Revolution, we were hunter-gatherers, and you pay attention to the world, and your gut instincts are what keep you alive. Mm. And then we start taking control of the world. I mean, you take a seed and you put the seed into the ground, everything changes. Suddenly, that ground is no longer the breast of the mother. It is yours. You own it. And the plant growing beside it is now a weed. And the animal coming along is vermin because it might eat your plant. And the tree putting it in shade has to be cut down because it won't grow properly. The whole world changes. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. There are other cultures. One culture I look at in some detail in my book, Radical Wholeness, is the Anglo-Ewe culture. So there's a book on the Anglo-Ewe culture by an anthropologist who is studying the senses. Mm-hmm. And the Anglo-Ewe don't have a word for senses, have a completely different experience of the senses from what we have. So their umbrella term for senses is sesalalame, mm-hmm. which means it translates as feel at flesh inside. And they feel the world in their flesh. So they don't hear with the ears, they feel the sounds of the world in their body. They don't see with the eyes, they feel the sights of the world in their body. And their primary sense is balance. And you think, well, that's kind of funny, right? We speak about a sense of balance. We have a sense organ devoted to balance. Why don't we include it? And that's where you start to see our cultural patterns at work. Every one of our senses reinforces the boundary. So the model of our senses is a stimulus comes from the outside world, it crosses the boundary of the self, arrives on a receptor, and is sent to the brain for interpretation. Every sense is like that, and balance isn't. Balance is this felt relationship in which you've been held since conception. Right? It's been there the whole of your life, and yet there's no boundary. And so we need the boundary in our culture. We have put so much faith in independence, and we're told to seek it in our lives and strive towards it, and there is no such thing. There's no single example of independence in the universe.
It's a myth, isn't
right?
it?
Yeah, I mean, everything leans on everything. Everything depends on everything. Everything affects everything at a level that beggars our imagination to conceive of it. Mm-hmm. So wholeness is the nature of the reality in which we live, and we have desensitized ourselves to it. Like, as a culture, it's so hard for us to feel the present as a whole. The present is no other than whole, but to feel it as a whole is difficult because we've desensitized. What does it mean to speak from the wholeness of your being? What does it mean to listen from the wholeness of your being? What does it mean to feel the self as a whole? What does it mean to feel the wholeness of yourself in relationship to the world? And so Radical Wholeness, the book, its central premise is that as a culture, we are whole blind.
Whole blind.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. Because everything is separated, right? It needs to be separated out so that we can analyze it and figure it out and understand it and think that we know it by separating it out. You want to know the human body? You cut it up.
Yeah, yeah. And everything we create in the world around us is an expression of the way we compartmentalize the body. So we live so deeply in either or modalities. Like, you can be analytical or you can go into a nice place of feeling. You know, you can live from the heart, but that intelligence is disconnected from the intelligence of the genitals. So you can be loving and then you can have sex. But to bring those together seems to be difficult for us. When I was a kid, all the movies were about romance and no sex, and now they seem to be about sex and no romances. But we it's like we live in this binary way within our own intelligence, and we are committed to this idea that we can think more clearly with a small portion of our intelligence in the cranium than we can with the whole of our beings. Mm-hmm. And it is killing us, and it's killing the planet, because you cannot know harmony in an abstract way. All you can do is feel it. And the body feels the present and feels the world, and we dismiss feeling as secondary. As you say, you want to name and categorize and objectively know. Well, you can't objectively know wholeness. Mm-hmm. Not possible.
Mm-hmm. Experiential, yeah.
Absolutely.
So when I was reading this article in The Sun, I loved how you broke down the different brains. Like you said, like we have the brain in our head, which most of us are familiar with, and we're beginning to understand that we also have a brain in the gut. And I love how you said that, we've discovered this 3 times this century or last century and forgotten it again. Yeah. So can you speak to that a little bit? What is, for those, because some people are like, what? There's no brain in the gut. What the hell are they talking about? Can you talk about the brain in the gut?
Absolutely. And it's really like we are so committed to this cultural story that the head should be in charge and the head is superior and the body is a vehicle, that there's no place in our story of what it means to be human for this brain in the belly. Mm-hmm. And it's a neurological fact. It's older in evolutionary terms than the brain in the head. It's our first brain in that regard. And what's interesting to me, the brain in the belly, its primary function physiologically is to digest food. When you digest food, you are turning the world into you, and you are turning you into the world. Right? You bite into an apple, and its flesh and its juice become your capillaries and your eyelashes. And it passes through you to nourish the apple tree. At least it did until toilets were invented. But that essential assimilation also shows up culturally. Like, there are cultures that honor the brain in the belly as the place where you come home to your profoundest truth. It's where you land in yourself and in the present. Japan, China, the Incans, the Mayans have this lovely image that the human being is born with 2 skulls. There's the cranial skull and the pelvic bowl.
Yeah.
And human life courses between them. So that's in their iconography. That's why snakes have 2 heads. Mm-hmm. That's the river of life running between those 2 skulls. So if the brain in the head is where you can consciously think, its essential strength is that it gains perspective on the world. Now, you gain perspective with distance. So the brain and the head can step back from the sensations of the body, step back from the present, and view it objectively. Mm-hmm. And perspective is wonderful. But to stay in a place of perspective is to live in a way that leaves you feeling disconnected and anxious and alienated and alone. That's the inevitable consequence of living in the head. Mm-hmm. And my work isn't about denying that intelligence, but that intelligence only comes into its full potential in relationship to that intelligence in the belly. Mm-hmm. They are meant to be together. They, like an idea that is unintegrated, that is merely a perspective, will impede your ability to be present, because you don't have to attend to what is. You know, that's a tree, that's a dog. You don't have to feel the living presence of the tree or of the dog. And in my workshop, there's one exercise where you take an idea in the head and you let that idea travel down through the body. And as it arrives on the pelvic floor, it is reborn as sensation. Mm-hmm. That sensitivity is the foundation of our intelligence. And we have so messed up our idea of what human intelligence is. We think human intelligence is a special category, as though it didn't evolve from the intelligence of the world. And we call it, the ability to reason in an abstract way. That's intelligence. And meanwhile, the whole of the world of nature feels the present and attunes to it and dances with it. And that happens in an ant colony. It happens with slime molds that I talk about in my book. It happens with murmurations of starlings. An animal feels the present and harmonizes with it. And it's an extraordinary thing. Like an ant colony, there's this great woman, Deborah Gordon, who studied harvester ants in the Arizona desert for 30 years. But she's and harvester ants sting. Anyway, God bless her, but she's completely upended our understanding of how an ant colony works. No ant ever gives another ant an instruction or a command. Mm-hmm. It is a completely unmanaged entity. And ants on their own are like frustratingly stupid. Two ants on the same colony, will pull on a twig back and forth, one in one direction, one in the other. For what? It's like pointless. And yet, as a colony, the intelligence. So intelligence is essentially an emergent phenomenon. It doesn't exist in a single ant. You can't take an ant apart and find the intelligence of the colony in the single ant. It's only when you get a critical mass of ants that intelligence emerges and attunes to the world and guides every single ant. And as human beings with this boundary around ourselves, we've cut ourselves off from the guidance that is there.
So then what happens, if that kind of intelligence is an emergent quality, that's what I'm really interested in at the moment, and if that is true, what happens when that kind of intelligence begins to emerge in people, right? Is there some kind of deeper connection between those people where it's emerged, where there is no commands given, there is no instruction, but there's some kind of cohesion on a deeper level? You see what I'm getting at?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You get a group of people walking around in their aloneness, and they have basically, with that tacit boundary, dulled themselves to the attunement that makes that guidance possible. And it's amazing, you think of there are prayer groups who sit in silence and pray and come out of the prayer with the same answer to the question they were praying about. Mm-hmm. There is quantum physics tells us that, has demonstrated unambiguously that matter and mind are fundamentally linked. It's like they're two properties of the same underlying phenomenon. And we live in we've defined the dimensions of our universe in a way that upholds boundaries. I mean, you think we live in a world of 3 spatial dimensions and 1 dimension of time.
Apparently.
Apparently. But each of those dimensions is about separation. That was 2 days ago. I'm, a foot and a half from my computer screen, whatever. They're all about separation. And there is a dimension in which everything is in contact with everything else at all times. And we just don't even name it. And it's like trying to hold water in a wicker basket. We try to contain our reality in these dimensions, and it leaks out. And we call those leaks anomalies, rather than recognizing them as the life we're living now.
So as you've been doing this work, what's your personal experience of reality like now?
I've, through decades, found my way. The primary wound in our culture is this separation between our thinking and our being. We've been taught that we can think more clearly if we shut down the sensation of the body and just do it in our heads. And it's taken me a long time to bring those back into relationship. But at this point, I feel every thought, and I recognize every sensation as a form of thought. And I just feel porous. There's the Anglo-Ewe culture. Anthropologists have studied them and remarked on their porosity of personhood.
Porosity of personhood.
Isn't that lovely?
It's a great phrase, the porosity of personhood.
And the other phrase is their radical indeterminacy of personhood.
Ooh.
So you contrast our culture with theirs. They have feel at flesh inside. What do we have? Think at head inside.
Yeah.
They have a radical indeterminacy of the self. We have a radical determinacy of the self. It's so important to know who you are and establish that. Well, you know what? That cuts off self-knowledge at the roots, because self-knowledge is not found by reaching inside. You reach inside, you do that work to clear the cotton balls, to open yourself to the present. And self-knowledge is born in us as we come into felt relationship with the world around. You come into relationship with a kid playing on the sidewalk, and you're illuminated in a special way. Or you come into relationship with a tree or the night sky or the call of an owl, and you are illuminated. You discover who you are through relationship.
Yeah.
And that's...
No, go ahead. That's...
Well, I was just to say, we've put all our eggs in the basket of knowledge, thinking knowledge will save us. And that's like an engine that drives our culture. And knowledge is lethal if it's not counterbalanced by self-knowledge. And we have lost self-knowledge. We think it's about naming who we are and fixing that as a structure within which we imprison ourselves, ultimately.
There's so much juiciness in there, and I can see, like, when I look at the explosion of yoga in like the last 10, 20 years, that to me speaks to this knowing that people had, that they're in their heads, and the journey back into the body. And you talk about having that felt sense of reality, and what I've observed is for many people, feeling reality is so painful. It's just so painful that the only way they've been able to operate in the world is to go into the head, to disassociate. Because, for whatever reason, feeling reality was really, really painful.
Yeah.
So do you find that when you're leading your workshops, that for some people there's blocks, there's challenges, there's tears, at just simply coming into felt relationship to the moment?
In my workshop, so much attention is brought so gently to the pelvic floor. And people begin to reclaim it, like without even realizing it. It's just, do you feel the breath in the pelvic floor? Do you feel, and the pelvic floor is a diaphragm. And the interesting thing is, the thoracic diaphragm can work and the pelvic floor can be held in tension, rigid. But if the pelvic floor releases, the thoracic diaphragm releases with it. You can't release the pelvic floor without that inclusiveness, that welcomes the whole of the body. So I experience the pelvic floor as the ground of my being.
Yeah.
Right? That's where I land. If you don't have a place to land in the body, how do you come back?
Yeah, how would you be in it? I mean, in the yogic terminology, Svadhisthana, like second chakra, is the seat of the self. It's the sweetness that's coming home to the self, of course, which is the pelvic floor. And so I can see how, the yogic framework is leading us on this, it's a similar journey of realizing the self, which is, of course, ultimately realizing that there is no self. There is nothing there,
Or I mean, I've got another model for the self, because we until we rest free of our addiction to independence and aloneness. So there's a phenomenon called a standing wave, and you can take a rope and shake it in just the right way that suddenly it looks like a series of loops with a still point in between each loop, and that still point is a node. Now, there are individual nodes along the length of the rope, but those nodes exist only by virtue of the energy that runs through them. So I can be an individual, but only by virtue of the energy that passes through me. I'm like a whirlpool held by a river. And there's no molecule in my body that's been there for more than a few years. It's this wash of the world becoming me and me becoming the world. Right? So I can sit in that stillness of the node and feel the world becoming me, feel the world holding me, feel me dissolving into the world. And that node of my experience is unique. But there's nothing about it that is separate from the world. It is unique because it's uniquely held by the world.
It's such a different way to perceive identity, right? Who we are, when you see it in that larger continuum, like you say, of the world becoming us and us becoming the world. And it's just everything is in continuum, in relationship, in flow, rather than fixed, discrete, separate.
And then you feel the flow, and you trust it as a child yearns to trust its mother. It is there with a wisdom that you couldn't second guess. You couldn't do better than. I mean, in my life, the greatest setbacks in hindsight are seen to be the greatest blessings. And we're so used to thinking our way forward, and figuring out and strategizing, and we forget what it is to feel our way forward. And we so forget what it is to feel our way forward that we're not even when we are feeling our way forward, we turn it into something else. So what I mean by that, when we speak, we believe we're delivering what we know to someone else. We're communicating it. And that's the Anglo-Ewe culture, to go back to them, speech for them is a sense. The anthropologist who was asking them about their senses realized she must not have been clear what she means by a sense. So she explained the whole thing again, and they're nodding their heads. Yes, of course, speech is a sense. Well, when you think about what actually happens with speech, when I begin a sentence, I don't know what the last word of it is going to be. The speaking of the sentence it's like placing words that enable the thought to move forward into clarity. Speech is enabling me to feel my way forward every bit as much as a hand in a dark room enables me to feel my way forward. So speech is a sense, but because we think of it as a delivery system, we conflate into self-consciousness. And when you live alone, when your primary relationship is with yourself rather than with the present, you're trapped in self-consciousness where you are supervising and watching and judging and flattering and goading the self with every minute. It's a self-consciousness is a divided state. Self-consciousness is the opposite of wholeness. And you get the thing about wholeness. There are ideals that we like, gorgeous ideals, compassion and truth and clarity and peace. But we try to strive for those directly. And by doing so, we invite a little risk. And the risk shows up in the moment when you come into a situation and you remind yourself, right, I should be compassionate here. And you know what compassion looks like, and you know what compassion feels like, and you bring yourself along to achieve it. And it's a top-down, supervised modality. Wholeness cannot be achieved because you're already whole. How do you escape it? There's nothing but wholeness. We can desensitize ourselves, but you can't achieve it. All you can do is surrender to it, bit by bit by bit. And as you surrender to it, as I come back to my wholeness, I can be no other than compassionate. I have peace. I mean, that's wholeness is utterly at peace. I have clarity. I have all those gorgeous ideals that I'm told to strive for directly, and we need orientation, but to surrender to wholeness, you don't know what that looks like. You drop into your wholeness and you're carried someplace. It's such a different thing.
Yeah, I can feel it. And I love what you say there, that these states of being that so often we can, like compassion or clarity, etc., we seek to strive for them. But it's that recognition that all that we need to do is drop down and come to wholeness, and then those states just are. They just arise naturally. And
it's a surrender to the truth of your being in this moment. And when I say your being, I don't mean the part of you that is inside your skin. It's like the node on the string. The node doesn't exist independent of the string. Your being is what you discover when you're fully present. Everything that is there is part of who you are in this moment.
It's a radical acceptance of what is right now, which is, I guess, why yoga's been so powerful for so many people, because it's a practice on the mat of accepting what's showing up as it's showing up. Before we wrap up, I feel like I could keep talking for hours, but time, that illusion of time. I'd love to know more about some of the tools that you use in your workshop when you're working with people, because it feels like, am I right in guessing that you are inviting people into an experience of wholeness, that's what they're about?
Yeah, so it's a weekend workshop, although in Australia I'm doing a 4-day retreat. Really excited about, but it's a weekend workshop that is totally experiential. It is like the practices are ridiculously simple, and they move through 4 themes. So it's like little steps, but the first theme is breath, and breath, especially in the pelvic floor, to feel the pelvic floor release to the in-breath, and release to the out breath. I mean, we're such a top-down culture. We've turned breathing into a top-down phenomenon. You know, we know a deep breath is important, and so we push it from the top down. And you look at a baby breathe, and it's just releasing to the breath, and it's such a gorgeous thing. And once the pelvic floor is awakened to its sensitivity, you've got a place to land. So the second theme is rest, and how to bring the body's energy to rest. How to make that choice and feel it happen. How to bring the center of your awareness down through the body to the perineum and have it rest there so that you see the world from there and feel it from there. It's such a different experience. And the theme of the third theme of the second morning is receptivity. So once you're at rest on the pelvic floor, you can receive the world into the pelvic bowl. And there is an equivalence between receptivity and presence. If I'm fully receptive to someone, I'm fully present to them. If I'm fully present to them, I'm fully receptive to them. So to exploring receptivity it like offers another doorway into an exploration of presence. And then the final theme of the afternoon on the second day is integration. How to experience the genius in the head is a genius of analysis. And we're trying to patch together our lives into wholeness with a tool whose specialty is breaking things into pieces. The intelligence in the pelvic bowl is where our genius for integration lies. It turns the world into us and us into the world. And anything you bring into contact with your being, and I really feel the core of my being in my pelvic bowl, to bring something into touch with the core of your being in that grounded way is to integrate it. And as it integrates, it rebirths as a sensitivity in some way. And sensitivity is the foundation of our intelligence. And if we can learn, it's the foundation of our intelligence, and when it's coupled with groundedness, because sensitivity is reactive. If my retina didn't react, I wouldn't see. It reacts to the light, and I see, but it's the groundedness of the body that makes coherent the information that's being accessed. So I understand intelligence as grounded sensitivity, and our culture is very, 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 very clever, but we've forgotten how to live intelligently. We just can't do it. And without the body, we never will. Without the body's intelligence, you cannot come into harmony relying on an intelligence that only knows how to break things into pieces.
So it feels like we're ripe for this work now, because, the yoga movement that swept the globe pretty much has brought people back into relationship with their bodies. It's kind of laid the groundwork, and now there's that sense of, okay, well, now what? Now I'm in relationship to now I can feel, now what, So it's really beautiful to feel this work coming through you. So thank you so much for sharing this with us today, and for making the trek down to New Zealand and Australia.
I've never been to New Zealand. I'm so looking forward to it. And I was in Australia once and just loved it. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.